Bless the Lord who forgiveth all our sins. Almighty God, in whom our hearts rose, all desires known, from whom those secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our heart by the inspiration of the Spirit, that we may perfectly love thee, and worthily magnify thy holy name, through Christ our Lord. Amen. God spake these words and said, I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods but me.
A reading from the book of Exodus. God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, I am the Lord your God. who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your manservant or your maidservant or your cattle or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord gives you. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
A reading from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Did that which is good bring death to me? By no means. It was sin, working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. So then it is no longer I that do it, but the sin which dwells within me. For I know nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. So I find it to be the law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God, in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, and making me captive of the law of sin, which dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I of myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please rise to receive the gospel.
Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen, sheep, and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. In making the whip of cords, he drove them all with the sheep and oxen out of the temple. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. You shall not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for my house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign have you to show us for doing this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken us 40 years to build this temple. You will raise it up in 3 days?" Before he spoke of the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. The Holy Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
Zeal for thy house will consume me. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. Well, as many of you know, I tend to take Fridays off. As a priest, that means that I work every Sunday. But it's legitimate. It's all right for me to work on a Sunday. But nonetheless, it means I do. I take Fridays off. But what it really means is that I take 8 hours off of this work to do 8 hours of work at home. It's usually how it works out. And what I end up doing all day, almost every Friday, is cleaning my house. Monday morning, it starts off with about this level of mess. And Tuesday, we're still all right. But then Wednesday's a busy day. And then Thursday's a busy day. And as I'm sure you know, with 3 kids at home, by the time Friday comes back around again, I've got another good 8 hours of cleaning ahead of me. But we, with our busy lives, that's what tends to happen. Every once in a while, you have to clean house. Well, I think we find in the gospel as Jesus came back home to Jerusalem, to the house of God, to his holy temple, he found the place needed cleaning out. I think that there are a great many lessons that we can take for cleaning out our own lives here this Lent and from this gospel. And so today that's what I would like to take a look at. And we can begin really at this very first verse. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem to the temple. Now, I don't think that any of us should be surprised that with the Passover at hand, that Jesus goes up to the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, after all, he seems to be a fairly religious guy. And so the temple is the type of place that we might expect him to be. But I think that there's a great deal more going on here than Jesus simply going up to worship at the temple for Passover. First of all, this is an ideal verse for us to celebrate on our own way through Lent. Passover, or Lent, as you know, is kind of symbolically our spiritual journey, our spiritual pilgrimage to the Holy Jerusalem itself, so that we can follow the steps of Christ through Holy Week. And so, as such, here you have Christ taking his own pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so it's entirely fitting for us that we should see in this passage our own Lenten pilgrimage to Jerusalem and take lessons from it. But I think that even more is here than just this connection with Christ's pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Even further is the fact of the temple. You see in our scriptures, Jerusalem is never just Jerusalem. Jerusalem always means something more. It's not just the historical stuff it was made of, but it's its spiritual significance that really matters. And I think that the same is true for the temple. And I think that we will also find as we look down through these passages, we find that John himself gives us an ideal interpretation of this passage. You see, when Jesus came in and drove out the money changers, and here's the thing, folks, if someone walked into this church today and did the same exact thing that Jesus did then, I don't think that any of us would be very happy. Let's say a poorly clad, somewhat homeless-seeming person walked into our church with a bunch of cords and started driving all of you out. It makes a lot of sense that the religious leaders of the day would say, "Who do you think you are? What gives you this authority to come in here and do this?" And Jesus, instead of giving a straight answer, gives them an answer that I myself would not accept should someone come into my church and say the same thing. Did you catch what he said? He said, "Raise this temple to the ground, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again." Someone came in and did that to this church, I would think they were crazy. I would probably simply give them a couple of bucks and send them on their way. But Jesus is not merely a homeless man. And he's not simply talking about a temple made with hands. John himself gives us the interpretation of Jesus' action and Jesus' words. And he says this, "But he spoke of the temple of his body." And the thing is this, is that we with our incarnational theology know that Christ incarnate, his body is not merely his body, but his body is also your body, and your body, and your body, and my body. The body of Christ is each and every one of us. And we ourselves, because of the incarnation, are the very temple of God himself. And I hope at this point that you will be able to begin to see the connections that can be made at this point. This Lent, as Jesus Christ himself makes his spiritual pilgrimage into the Jerusalem and the temple of your own heart, the question for each of us is, what will he find there? Will he find everything in order and operated in a worshipful manner as it should be? Or will he find something else? What will he find in your heart this Lent? To get the answer to that, we only need to go to the next verse. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. Now that sounds pretty bad to us, doesn't it? But in their defense, let's describe historically what was actually taking place here. Of course, the temple was not just a place where they came and sang hymns. The temple was a place of sacrifice. And for sacrifice, you need animals to sacrifice. The thing is this, is that for the Passover, people wouldn't just be coming down the street to their local temple. There was only one temple for all of Israel. And so people would literally be traveling days and maybe even weeks with entire families. And remember, they didn't have campers and fast food restaurants back then. But everything that's required for you to function at home, you have to bring with you on this long journey. And I would have to say that dragging an oxen or some cattle behind me for a trip like this would make things rather difficult. And so this system that they came up with was this. Hey, let's do the practical thing, and let's have animals that they can sacrifice here instead of bringing their own animals to sacrifice. You can just bring your money and purchase an animal and make a sacrifice. Makes it nice and easy and simple. But the problem with that is this, my friends, is that very rarely is the practical thing ever the spiritual thing. When I was in Ohio, I had a friend who was a Methodist minister. And in their church, they added an extra service. And for this service, they took out all the pews and they met instead in a gymnasium. And they put, instead of pews, they put in round tables with tablecloths and decorations. And they had donuts and casseroles and coffee every Sunday morning while the service was going on. And this service ended up attracting a lot of people, and the pastor thought it was a great idea. Until, because it is really rather practical, is it not? These pews are uncomfortable. It's got a nice cushion and you fall asleep. But give yourself a nice round table, a couple of donuts and some coffee, and you'll be wide awake, ready and raring to go. But after a while, this pastor approached me and he began to regret that he'd ever done this. Primarily because instead of people sitting and listening to the sermon or participating in the worship, they would simply sit there and chat with their neighbors and have coffee. Worship was no longer worship, and worship started to become something entirely different. He regretted this especially because it became one of their most popular services. Why not? Free donuts and coffee. And so it was one of their most popular services. It wasn't simply something that he could undo. He couldn't just chase them out with ropes, as Jesus did. It became part and parcel of their worship. Instead of worship, they had coffee. Instead of enjoying a sermon and gaining spiritual sustenance, they instead had a coffee hour. They had a cafe. And everything that was once church was no more. And sadly, I think that quite often, it's easy for us in our beautiful church and in our pews to kind of look on that with disdain, isn't it? But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that far too often we do the same thing in our own hearts and in our own lives. When was the last time that you didn't say morning or evening prayer because it was too impractical? Because you were too busy? Because it was too difficult? When was the last time that you stopped reading the scriptures and meditating on them because it took too much time. It didn't quite fit. You had other things to do. When was the last time that you decided to hold on to a grudge in your heart instead of approaching someone you love with mercy, compassion, and forgiveness? It's easy to find the fault in others, but it's not always so easy to find the fault within ourselves. Each of us are called to look into the temple of our hearts and to find those places where we have replaced the worship of God with something else, with something more worldly. And what better time to do that, my friends, than Lent? And this brings me to my third and final point. St. John says this. He says, his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for thy house will consume me." But what then does this mean for each and every one of us? What would it look like for you today if zeal for the house of your own temple, the temple of your own body, the temple of your own mind, the temple of your own heart, what would it look for you? What would it look like for you to be consumed with zeal in regards to that temple? Because, my friends, what better time to clean house than Lent? What better time to look inward and find the disorder of our hearts than during Lent? What better time to have Christ come in and clean house than Lent? Let us not allow it to pass without making a change. But with this, I think it's important to have a reminder. And right here, I think, is a good connection to our epistle reading for today. Now, in Romans chapter 7, all the way through 6, 7, and 8, St. Paul has some very difficult theology and some very difficult proofs and arguments to follow. But I think if there's one thing that needs to stick out to each of us today and in light of this gospel and in the context of Lent, it is this singular line right here, where St. Paul says, "So then it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh." You see, far too often as we approach our own sinfulness within the context of Lent, it begins to get far too depressing. And what we end up doing is we begin equating ourselves with the sin that dwells within us. But I want you to note that St. Paul makes an important distinction here. What he finds as evil is not himself, but the sin that dwells within him. Each of us are like a boat, but here's the thing, the boat's a good boat. The boat floats, but it's filled with a bad cargo. The thing to do, my friends, is not to sink the boat in depression. Rather, the thing to do is to throw over the cargo. Then you've got a good boat. What was evil about the temple that day? Was the temple itself evil? Or was the stuff that was taking place within it? And how important it is for each of us to remember the grace of God. And to remember that it is not we that God condemns, but the sin that dwells within us. And it is not we that are to be undone, but the sin that dwells within us. And that, my friends, is what Lent is all about. Every week at about Friday, I realize that my house is just a little too messy to dwell in. So do I quit dwelling in it, or do I clean it? I clean it. And that, my friends, is what each of us are called to do. What do you have to put in order in your house today? Have you begun to put money before the worship of the Lord? Well, then today's the day to put the order right. Have you begun to put your profession before your wife and your children? Well, then today's the day to get the order right. Have you begun to hold grudges instead of compassion and mercy and forgiveness? Well, then today is the day to get the order right. I pray that each of us, for what was said about Christ can also be said about us. Zeal for thy house will consume me. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Now let us affirm our faith in the words of the Nicene Creed. I believe in one God,
Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of his Father before all worlds, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven, and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary, and was made man, and was crucified also for us under Pontius Pilate. He suffered and was buried, and the third day he rose again, according to the Scriptures, and ascended into heaven, and is sitting on the right hand of the Father, and he shall come again with glory to judge both the quick and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end. And I believe in the Holy Ghost, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeded from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son together is worshipped and glorified, who spake by the prophets. And I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I acknowledge one baptism for the remission of sins, and I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Amen.
Let us pray for the whole state of Christ's church and world. Almighty and ever-living God, who in thy holy word has taught us to make prayers and supplications and to give thanks for all men, receive these our prayers which we offer unto thy divine majesty, beseeching thee to inspire continually the universal church with the spirit of truth, unity, and concord. And grant that all those who do confess thy holy name may agree in the truth of thy holy word and live in unity and godly love. Lord, in thy mercy, give grace, O Heavenly Father, to all bishops and other ministers, especially the Reverend Brian Chase, our rector, the Very Reverend John Munson, our dean, the Right Reverend William Wantland, our assisting bishop, the Right Reverend Jack Eicher, our bishop, and the Most Reverend Foley Beach, our archbishop, that they may, both by their life and doctrine, set forth thy true and lively word, and rightly and duly administer thy holy sacraments. Lord, in thy mercy, and to all thy people give thy heavenly grace, and especially to this congregation here present, that with meek heart and due reverence they may hear and receive thy holy word, truly serving thee in holiness and righteousness all the days of their life. Lord, in thy mercy, we beseech thee also to rule the hearts of those who bear the authority of government in this and every land, especially Stephen Santayana, our mayor, Craig Estes, our state senator, Greg Abbott, our governor, and Donald Trump, our president, that they may be led to wise decisions and right actions for the welfare and peace of the world. Lord, in thy mercy, open, O Lord, the eyes of all people to behold thy gracious hand in all thy works, that rejoicing in thy whole creation, they may honor thee with their substance and be faithful stewards of thy bounty. Lord, in thy mercy, and we most humbly beseech thee of thy goodness, O Lord, to comfort and succor Gail, Bob, Delwood, Phil, Kathy, Carolyn, Philip, George, Britta, Megan, Bonnie, Christian, Brandy, Roy, Eva, all others for whom we now pray. And all those in this transitory life are in trouble, sorrow, need, sickness, or any other adversity. Lord, in thy mercy, and we also bless thy holy name for all thy servants departed this life in thy faith and fear, especially Robert Popham, Dewey Seymour, others for whom we now pray. Beseeching thee to grant them continual growth in thy love and service, and to grant us grace so to follow the good examples of St. George Herbert, St. Oswald, St. David, St. Chad, Saints John and Charles Wesley, the ever-blessed, ever-Virgin Mary, and of all thy saints, that with them we may be partakers of thy heavenly kingdom. Lord, in thy mercy, grant these our prayers, O Father, for Jesus Christ's sake, our only mediator and advocate. Amen.
Ye who do truly and earnestly repent you of your sins and are love and charity with your neighbors, and intending a new life, following the commandments of God and walking from henceforth in his holy ways, draw near with faith and make your humble confession to Almighty God, devoutly known. Almighty God,
Our Lord Jesus Christ, maker of all things, judge of all men, we acknowledge and bewail our manifold sins and wickedness, which we from time to time most grievously have committed, by thought, word, and deed, against thy divine majesty, provoking most justly thy wrath and indignation against us. We do earnestly repent, and are heartily sorry for these our misdoings. The remembrance of them is grievous unto us, the burden of them is intolerable. Have mercy upon us, have mercy upon us, most merciful Father, for thy Son, our Lord Jesus Christ's sake. Forgive us all that is past, and grant that we may ever hereafter serve and please thee in the newness of life, to the honor and glory of thy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, who of his great mercy hath promised forgiveness of sins to all those who with hearty repentance and true faith turn unto him, have mercy upon you, pardon and deliver you from all your sins, confirm and strengthen you in all goodness, and bring you to everlasting life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Hear the word of God to all who truly turn unto him. If any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, and he is the perfect offering for our sins, and not for ours only, but for the sins of the whole world. The peace of the Lord be always with you. Good morning, folks. Got just a couple of quick announcements for you. First of all, as always, we've got Generations this Wednesday, and everyone is more than welcome to join us for Generations. Dinner will start at 5:30, and catechism starts at 6 o'clock. We've got something for every age group, so if you've got kids, we've got a ministry for the kids, and if you're an adult, we've got a ministry for the adults. So everyone's more than welcome to join us this Wednesday for Generations. On top of that, all the way through Lent, we'll be doing Stations of the Cross at 5:30 here at the church. And here we had a really nice crowd this past week. And we've got beautiful, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but our stations all throughout the church here I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that these have all been made for this church. These are all original artwork, works of art. And so, even if you don't do stations, take some time this night to go around and take a look at each of these, because they're really very beautiful and also culturally appropriate. for this part of Texas. So anyways, they're beautiful things. Feel free to come either at 5:30 on Fridays for the stations, or and the booklets are in the back. You can do stations on your own at any time throughout the week that you wish to do so. Now, for a really, really big announcement, the next Sunday is a very important Sunday because it's daylight savings. So if you don't want to be late for church, and if you don't want everyone to just kind of turn around and look at you as you come through the door, halfway through the service, set your clocks back on Saturday. Ahead, gosh. You can do that. Set your clocks, spring forward. Set your clocks ahead on Saturday. I don't know why they don't. I think they should do it on Sunday night instead of Sunday morning, because I'd rather be late for work. I think that would be ideal. But anyways, that's what we've got coming up next week. On top of that, as you know, Holy Week is coming up very quickly, and we're going to do a card writing campaign. We want everybody in our directory and then some to receive a personal invitation to all of our Holy Week services. Our candidate for Holy Orders, Randy Rogers, will be spearheading this, and we're going to have a card writing campaign on March 18th in the parlor, and we'll have lunch available. So if you have nice handwriting, or even if you don't have nice handwriting, you're more than welcome to come and join us for that card writing campaign. Also, every year our parish likes to send as many youth as we can to Camp Cruces for free. The church pays for it, and so if you have children or grandchildren that are of Camp Cruces age, we've got registrations in the back of the church. They look something like this. Feel free to take that home, take a look over it, and fill it out, and get it back to us. The registration price jumps up to 2 times as much as it is now, I think, at the end of the month. So we'd like to have all of these in by the 18th, if at all possible. So if you have kids or grandkids that would be interested in going to Camp Cruces, the sign-ups are in the back. And then finally, for our Lenten alms this Sunday, today, many of you know Bishop Ackerman. He has a parish in Fort Worth called St. Timothy's. Over the past year, St. Timothy's has been vandalized and burglarized several times. His parish has lost more than $20,000. And so we would like to send them a check and give them some help. So all of you have got a colored envelope in your bulletin today. Any money or checks that go into that envelope will be sent on to St. Timothy's to help them recoup some of the costs and some of the things that they've lost. With that, I believe that's all that I've got for announcements. Are there any birthdays this week for us? Indeed. There are some birthdays this week. Look at you. You're looking like quite a big boy. How old are you now? 4? Well, that's great. Well, can I pray for you for your birthday? All right. Lord be with you. Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you for Carter. Lord, we thank you for the blessing that he has to us. We pray that you bless him on his birthday. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. We continue this offertory, offering God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and make good thy vows to the Most High. we should at all times and in all places give thanks unto thee, O Lord, Holy Father, Almighty, everlasting God, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who was in every way tempted as we are, yet did not sin, by whose grace we are able to triumph over every evil, and to live no longer unto ourselves, but unto him who died for us and rose again. Therefore, with angels and archangels, and with all the company of heaven, we laud and magnify thy glorious name, evermore praising thee and saying, all glory be to thee, Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, for that thou, by tender mercy, didst give thine only Son, Jesus Christ, to suffer death upon the cross for our redemption, who made there, by his one oblation himself, once offered a full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice, oblation, and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world, and did institute, and in his holy gospel command us to continue a perpetual memory of that his precious death and sacrifice until his coming again. For in the night in which he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Likewise, after supper, he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink ye all of this, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for you and for many for the remission of sins. Do this as oft as you shall drink it, in remembrance of me. Wherefore, O Lord and Heavenly Father, according to the institution of thy dearly beloved Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, we, thy humble servants, do celebrate and appear before thy divine majesty, with these thy holy gifts which we now offer unto thee, the memorial thy Son hath commanded us to make, having in remembrance his blessed passion and precious death, his mighty resurrection and glorious ascension, rendering unto thee most hearty thanks for the innumerable benefits procured unto us by the same. And we most humbly beseech thee, O merciful Father, to hear us with thy almighty goodness, vouchsafe to bless and sanctify with thy word and Holy Spirit these thy gifts and creatures of bread and wine, that we, receiving them according to thy Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, of the institution, in remembrance of his death and passion, and partakers of his most blessed body and blood. And we earnestly desire thy Father and goodness, worse than to accept this, our sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, most humbly beseeching thee to grant that, by the merits and death of thy Son, Jesus Christ, and through faith in his blood, we and all thy whole church may obtain remission of our sins, and all the benefits of his passion. And here we offer and present unto thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls and bodies, to be a reasonable, holy, and living sacrifice unto thee, humbly beseeching thee that we and all others, who shall be partakers of this holy communion, may worthily receive the most precious body and blood of thy Son, Jesus Christ, be filled with thy grace and healing benediction, and made one body with him, that he may dwell in us and be in him. And although we are unworthy, through our manifold sins, to offer and the sacrifice, yet we beseech thee to accept this our thy duty and service, not weighing our merits, but pardoning our offenses, through Jesus Christ our Lord. by whom and with whom, in the unity of the Holy Ghost, all honor and glory be unto thee, O Father Almighty, world without end. Amen. Let us, our Savior Christ, have taught us, we are bold to say, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us.
Therefore let us keep the feast.
We do not presume
To come to this thy table, Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table, but thou art the same Lord, whose property is always to have mercy. Grant us therefore, gracious Lord, so to eat the flesh of thy dear Son Jesus Christ, and to drink his blood, that we may evermore dwell in him, and he in us. Amen.
the gifts of God and the people of God. Take these in remembrance that Christ died for you, and feed on them in your heart by faith with thanksgiving. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God,
We most heartily thank Thee, for Thou hast received us into the soul's mysteries, with the spiritual food of our precious body and blood, of Thy Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, and thus assure us thereby of Thy favor and goodness towards us, and that we are very members incorporate in the mystical body of Thy Son, the blessed company of all faithful people, and are also heirs through hope of Thy everlasting kingdom. And we humbly beseech Thee, O Heavenly Father, so to assist us with Thy grace, that we may continue in that holy fellowship, and do all such good works as Thou hast prepared for us to walk in, through Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom with Thee and the Holy Ghost be all honor and glory, world without end. Amen.
the peace of God which surpasses all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, and the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, be amongst you and remain with you always. Amen. Our processional hymn is number 411 in the hymnals, number 411. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness comprehended it not. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His glory, the glories of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The Mass is ended. Depart in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.